All right, welcome everybody to the world's greatest podcast. My name is Craig Rente, your host, the world's greatest podcast host, and I'm happy to announce we have world's greatest podcast coffee mug. Sorry, Matt, you didn't get one today. Maybe next time. Today we want to talk about audits in general and what we're seeing in the market and who's auditing and who's not auditing and best practices and all that fun stuff. And I thought it would be amazing to have Matt Giuliano from Palisade to come and talk to us a little bit about audits. So, Matt, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
Are you really?
It is recording this on a Monday morning after a bunch of birthday parties, but yeah, well, there are worse places I could be today.
All right. Well, there is a ringing endorsement. There are worse things I could be doing right now. So, Matt, why don't you, for those few people in the audience who might not know who you are, maybe you can give a little background on why people should listen to you when it comes to audits.
Sure. So I started at Oracle shortly after the acquisition of BEA, and have over 15 years of Oracle experience now. Back at my time at Oracle, I primarily worked around building out the WebLogic audit program and slowly wormed my way into the database and e-business suite, and eventually started doing a lot of the training for audits that Oracle still follows today.
Yeah, so Matt has both conducted audits for big tech, trained people to do audits, created tools and algorithms and methods for people to uncover non-compliance, and then for the last 10 or so years sat on the other side of the table, helping defend from those very same things. So I think really great background from both sides. And one of the things that Matt has been doing for the last couple of years is not Oracle audit defense, but everybody else audit defense. And I remember, Matt, when we started talking about this, I was pretty concerned that, oh my gosh, we're just Oracle experts. We're not going to be able to help with other vendors. But one of the things that I've learned is it's not just the expertise of a particular vendor, but it's just being an auditor and understanding how to audit. And there are some commonalities across vendors that, your expertise over here in Oracle really transfers to helping with, you know, Red Hat audits or VMware audits or whoever audits. So what are the commonalities? Like what makes a good audit defender?
Well, it's always funny because there's a lot of familiar faces when we see these at the other companies because Oracle has such a reputation for being so cutthroat when it comes to the audits and really getting in there and being thorough and aggressive that a lot of the people who developed these programs and have a lot of experience from before the whole process got broken down into, more assembly line model where auditors at Oracle today know their specialty only. They don't know the whole process start to finish. Most of the people who do got hired by other software companies to go out and start their compliance programs. So there are a lot of commonalities because there's a lot of familiar faces. The same people who, we trained at Oracle to do audits are the people who went out and started these programs and followed a lot of the same core principles when getting these new programs off the ground, which, when you're going through and arguing against these other programs, these other companies, even when we don't have the same technical depth that we do from, the 15 plus years of Oracle, we still see a lot of the same approaches in general, a lot of the same contract language, and those building blocks are all the same. And, we can still kind of manage the whole process even as we dive into the technical details and figure out, all right, where does this deviate from, what other companies are doing, and kind of, build out, some of these smaller companies have their special sauce in their license footprint that, we work our way through.
It's funny that you say that because Oracle is sort of known as this breeding ground for executives. Like, look at all the CEOs or many of the CEOs that are heading up other companies. They've started at Oracle. So, I know personally, I learned a ton there. Went out and did my own thing. So, yeah, I've noticed the same thing. Like, I remember that person. They used to be over there, and I remember that person. Or you go into LinkedIn and you can find the connection. Like, there's always one off. So it is a community of auditors out there, and there's only so many ways to do an audit. When I think about the process, what are you licensed for? What are you using, and what's the difference, right? And how do you leverage that? Is there one of the things that I say to customers and prospective customers all the time is that compliance audits, be they on-prem software or SaaS audits, are not necessarily from the vendor side the search for the ultimate truth. It's not the search for the ultimate truth. It's the search for the ultimate leverage. Is that consistent? Are we seeing anyone sort of have you come across any vendors? Say, boy, they really do audits well and they come up with the truth and they sort of are impartial, or are they all just pushing their own agendas and trying to generate revenue?
That is really the exception more than the rule. Generally speaking, the approach to audits is find a reason to make a sale. It's not even going to necessarily be what they're finding audit evidence on. We've seen, auditors come in for one program, but the sales team ultimately resolves the audit for a completely separate one. It really is about building leverage. Along the way, you find the truth and you find out what the customer needs and what they actually are using and what they actually are going to gain a business benefit from. But that's usually kind of a side note in figuring out how to structure a deal to close the audit more than substantiate the findings. Um, One of the things I always talk about with any audit quite often is, and this is gonna, again, we were talking about feeling old versus young. I watched a lot of Price is Right, and
Come on down. Yes.
the Plinko board. That's always how I look at audits, as the Plinko board. People always expect us to come in and talk about, all right, give me the playbook. Give me exactly what this audit is going to look like from day one to, day 100. And, you know, Oracle, Red Hat, Broadcom, everyone has their internal playbook that, that how they want their audit to go. But ultimately, when we're doing any specific audit and figuring out, all right, how do we throw wrenches into the works? How do we figure out the best way to keep, the vendor off their game while making sure we're getting a better picture of, what the compliance position is ahead of the vendor? uh, it's a Plinko board. We kind of throw wrenches in and we see, all right, they could go this way or that way. It's going to bounce. You don't know which way it's going to bounce. And then depending on that, the next one's going to split. And, we can kind of tell you what the board looks like and we can tell you all the possible way things that can go. But once things start going, there's, enough known unknowns that those audits really do kind of take some turns along the way. As long as you know ultimately you're aiming for the bottom, you kind of know where those outcomes are going to be, but you don't know what path you're going to take getting there.
And right now, our producer Marissa is desperately searching for a Plinko board video to put in here so she can edit
I
that
almost
in.
bought one at a flea market last week solely for the purpose of putting it in my office in the background to use as a prop during that conversation because it does come up more than you'd think.
Well, you should use that when you're talking to customers. Just, okay, here we go. Here's the audit letter, and let's see where the result is. Um, so the, a few things that you mentioned there, I want to get to. So Palisade now is more than just Oracle audit defense. We're defending from all of these clients, and we've spent a long time doing this for customers who are ours existing, and we would help them out. And sort of now we're more generally in the market publicly that we're doing this. Um, if you get an audit letter from a vendor, any vendor, And let's say you're not a Palisade, right? If you're a Palisade customer, we want you to call us, right? So, because we're there to help. But if you're not our customer, what do you do? If you're in procurement or IT or legal, or you get this random letter from, email from a vendor that says, hey, per section 123 of your contract, we are auditing you and we want to set up a meeting by the end of the week. What do you do?
First thing we do on any of those, regardless of the vendor, even on someone like Oracle, where, we've read thousands of them, is you look at the letter, you read, what are they referring to? What is the contract that it's pointing to as it's right? And you go and read that contract. Because if it doesn't exist in the contract, it does not exist. A lot of vendors will try to, invoke an audit and then, all right, we have a meeting on the calendar for next week. If you don't accept it, we're going to escalate this because you're dragging your feet. Contracts typically have a notice period of when they can conduct the audit. What are the criteria under which they can access data? Do you need any additional NDAs or other, contracts in place governing how that work is going to be done? Sometimes you're getting an audit letter from a third party as opposed to from the vendor themselves. Not all the contracts actually support a third party doing the audit, and you can insist it get done by the first party. So there's a lot of responses that you can make to that initial reach out on the audit that aren't necessarily straightforward beyond you might just read it and think, all right, well, I have to respond to this. And it's also just incredibly important for that very first thing of how you respond to the letter, because that's going to also generally be the vendor's first impression of how you are going to be throughout the process. If they send you a threatening audit letter that's not supported by the contract and you respond to it and you jump on that meeting and you're immediately responsive, what you've just told that vendor is, I haven't actually read the contract that you're citing. I did what you asked without validating it internally first. And it's very important to establish early, day one of audit with any vendor, that you are not going to be a pushover, that you are not just going to give them what they ask without validating why they need it and whether they have a right to it. And those little things do, kind of set expectations for how that audit is going to be managed.
Back to your Plinko board, right? So you could, they drop the audit letter and okay, there's this little peg that says, we don't have to respond in a month, in 3 days, or we don't have to, or you don't have that provision in your contract. Sometimes I guess they do, right? Maybe, if I'm a vendor auditing, hopefully I'm creating a process that is supported by those documents and contracts, and I'm not just making stuff up. But my experience has been, 9 times out of 10, you get a letter from a vendor, you're just going to do it. Right. And I think, why do vendors do all these audits? Why do they sort of create these systems? Because it works. Right. It's sort of, if you're not prepared or not represented or not supported, there's a reason why the vendor's auditing you, right? These are not accidental happenstance audits, correct? I mean, there's some method to their madness when they send out those letters.
So I can't speak to every vendor, but I think you and I have chatted on the side at some point. One of the last big projects I did do at Oracle was sitting down and essentially uh, creating a ranking system is a strong phrase, but kind of scoring, if you have two customers who are similar size, similar industry, similar whatever, which one of them is more likely to provide a beneficial outcome for an audit? So, Oracle has that ranking. God knows if they've updated it in a decade, but they have it. And it's one of those things that I'm sure every other vendor is also working on their own scores and reasons. Um,
I mean,
without
creating an audit practice for a vendor, I'm going to put my vendor hat on. That costs money, right? It's, eventually you'll get money from it. But if I'm an executive in a technology company and I'm thinking about creating an audit practice, there's an expense to that. I've got to hire people or reallocate resources and sort of do all that. So I want to make sure, as that tech vendor exec, that I get a quick ROI, that I get some quick wins, that I generate some dollars. And rather than just, you know, downloading a list of our clients and sort of picking them at random, I'm going to go ask. I'm going to go ask the sales leadership. I'm going to go ask the support organization. I'm going to ask consulting. I want to see from our delivery side if I'm a SaaS customer, if I'm a SaaS provider, I'm going to look at their usage statistics, um, and I'm going to target. I mean, that just makes common sense. I don't know. I haven't seen one vendor, or, they haven't, it's totally random. Congratulations. You got picked. It just doesn't make any sense. So if I'm already, when I go in there and I'm talking to a customer who's got the audit letter, right? So I'm typically doing that more on, initially on the sales side, right? So they'll come to us saying, hey, we've got this big problem. Obviously, I want to get them comfortable with us and our approach. Um, but one of the things I tell everyone is they already think you're guilty. This is, again, not the search for the truth. It's the search for leverage to get you to write a big check. And that's what I've seen. And now then I transition more into the delivery role, and you get in there and you're leading the charge, and maybe I'm connected somewhat to these. Um, but there's that assumption of you need to prove yourself innocent versus me needing to prove you guilty. So is that true? I mean, do vendors go and say, prove you're innocent? Because that's really hard to prove. Prove you're not doing this. Well, how the heck do I do that? Versus I'm going to show and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you're actually out of compliance.
Well, that's something that we come in and manage a lot is, and this also depends on how early people are getting help and getting involved because, we see cases where, someone starts handling an audit on their own and they misspeak or they, have support tickets where, someone in your IT organization is asking a question that refers to a certain kind of usage. And these audits come in with, this person in your IT organization said you were doing this on this date, prove to us that you weren't. And, it's one of those cases where, and sometimes that person misspoke. That person didn't actually have the knowledge, or that person might have been asking, for a hypothetical quote to price out possible implementation. The circumstances get completely lost, and these vendors come in and will ask you to prove that you didn't do anything wrong, which really speaks back to you need to manage the processes from day one to make sure that you don't start digging a hole that you're going to have to climb out of. And two, it really does come down, and this I feel like I need to get this on a plaque somewhere. um, we never wait for a vendor to tell us the compliance position. They all want to collect data and then come back to you with a report and say, all right, this is what your compliance position is, and here's your bill. We always approach it completely opposite direction of presenting the vendor with our compliance position and then giving them the data that supports it and asking them to, poke at the edges, to ask for more data if they need it. But we very much make it a here is what our position is, here's how we got there. Please try to prove us wrong instead of just letting the vendor come in and control the whole process and kind of have that prove the negative situation start from day one.
Yeah, that's, when I think about license audits versus tax audits, a tax audit, when you give that data, your bank account information, your investments, whatever, um, over to the other side, you all know the rules, right? You can all come up with the calculation at the end that it's going to be, you're going to owe this much, or you're going to get this much back. But vendors are really good at not sharing the rules or even making up the rules because it's a brand new situation. Technology's changing. People are moving to the cloud. Obviously, you're in different data centers. Now we've got the whole use of bots and AI and sort of how that's going to be measured. So these vendors, they'll come up with a scenario they haven't seen before, right? Is this usage of the product and should we be charging it? And then they're probably thinking, I don't know, let's Yeah, sure. This one is usage, right? We haven't seen this before, and let's see if it sticks. So, I love the approach of not waiting for an answer, right? When I hear that, and when we talked a little bit about, what do you do at the beginning of an audit, but what about the end, right? We'll get people who call us up saying, "Hey, I'm being audited by VMware Broadcom. I've given all the information. Help me, right? So you're sort of at the very end, or I've got this compliance report and it says I owe $10 million. I need to get this bill down. So what should people be doing in that situation, right? Someone else in the organization ran this audit, surprise finding $10 million. It gets to the execs. He's like, what? Or she's like, what do they do at that point, right? Is it over? Like, are vendors doing these audits correctly? Are there ever mistakes at the end of the audit process that you can sort of go back and, get that bill down to significantly or even to zero?
Getting people to acknowledge mistakes is one thing. Finding the mistakes is something else. We usually, when we get these late stage audits of trying to work backwards from a final report, we basically, run the whole thing back. We'll go back through the emails, through the data that was provided, through, the questions that weren't asked, the documentation that was provided, and start figuring out where we can make the cases. Um, it's always easier, obviously, to have preventative care and, ask the right questions at the right time, withhold data they didn't need that opens the door to other questions if decide you're looking for a problem. But ultimately, even in cases where, someone is just yes-anding the auditor through the entire process and handing it all over, we do start working our way backwards and figure out where did this go off the rails? What can we start walking back? Who can we throw under the bus?
Right.
But you got to figure out the way to walk back. That person in procurement told you a technical detail that they misunderstood. You can't really hold us to that because it wasn't accurate. It wasn't. So you got to find out where throwing people under the bus is a strong phrasing, but you figure out where did things get misphrased or someone speak outside of their expertise. A lot of these products include restricted use licenses or bundles that aren't always clear. I remember, and this is an Oracle example, but WebLogic and Web Center got rebranded. I think I was there, got rebranded 3 times in 4 years of just depending on what you bought any given year, you had completely different components that were included. And it's stabilized since. But to this day, if I see orders from, 2011, 2012, you have to go back and be like, all right, wait, hang on. What year was this again? What month was this? And, did they rebrand it? Just everything kind of melds together. And the vendor doesn't even keep it straight half the time.
But you said, you were talking about, throwing people under the bus and sort of, people misunderstand. I guess I was looking at it in a different way, finding errors that the vendors make. Like just because the vendor says you're out of compliance doesn't necessarily mean you're out of compliance, right? They do make mistakes. I would imagine, again, they're not bringing us into their quality control. I would imagine for all these vendors, one of their KPIs is not, did I do a good audit? Was I factually accurate? Was the customer satisfied? Did we agree on the results? Their KPIs are how many did I do? How much did it cost? And how much revenue did I generate?
I
So
mean,
yeah,
in that vein, overwhelmingly, auditors don't actually read any given agreement. They're
how is
trained
that
on
possible? How do they audit? That blew
it.
when I found that out, and I didn't find that out until I started Palisade, right? And I was defending Oracle's customers from audits from the group I used to manage. And I would get on the phone with the Oracle auditors and talk about the agreements and like, oh, we haven't read them.
They're trained to the boilerplate. They have this is what is the default, this is what's in the training material, and this is what the auditors are meant to be doing. because these days the auditors aren't necessarily licensed or technical experts. A lot of them have never worked with the technology they're actually auditing. And ultimately, they are trained to follow their script, collect the data that they're told to collect, and look for the markers that they're supposed to find. But a lot of the times, if you have any custom language negotiated into your agreements that deviates in any way from the boilerplate, no one at the auditor is going to have read it. And, it's very easy to find errors in reports if you have, a non-standard user definition, if you have a non-standard virtualization definition, if got a particular bundle that wasn't on a price list at the time that you negotiated, kind of on the side, all those things get missed all the time, and you can have a final report that kind of misses any of that nuance. And that's one of those things when we're running the whole audit back that we look for, because it's very easy to turn that proven negative around on an auditor, because once we find a couple of mistakes where it's not a matter of judgment, oh, well, we think that's restricted use coverage. Oh, we don't. It, there's some push and pull and there's negotiation on that because it's not always clear. But when there's just a categorical misrepresentation of what is a user because they didn't read the agreement, it becomes very easy to let that snowball into, well, you made one mistake. How many mistakes haven't we found yet? So it helps to pick up that momentum and start to run that whole audit back to the beginning. And we've had a couple of cases over the years where we essentially had the audit restart because we were able to find enough problems.
It as you're explaining that, I'm thinking about, Red Hat, I think uses Deloitte to do some of their audits.
Yeah.
And and then we've seen, Connor Consulting, going in there and doing some audit for some vendors. There is it is from a vendor perspective, they often can make more money if they do the audits poorly. They don't look at the details. And so they can put, when I think of, how Deloitte is in there for some of these vendors, they could put some junior people on these audits who are not that experienced and come out with a good result for the vendor. Now, they might leave some money on the table because they might not dig enough in certain areas to uncover some problems. But in general, doing technically a bad audit for a vendor could end up with a really good result. And I think about it from the other side, from the targets of those audits, the consumers of the technology, they need to have some really experienced people on their side, right? Because if they do it poorly, it's going to end badly for them, right? They need to do it really well. They need to do the digging, do the due diligence, do the audit first, have the answer, challenge the whole process. It's just a really different dynamic and the leverage that the technology vendors have in this whole process. It's like the system is rigged against the consumer, right? If a vendor really wants to put their hand on the scale and tip it into their favor, it's not that difficult, right? Just throw a lot of people at it and have a script that people have to follow. 9 times out of 10, they will, and there'll be a result that, if the vendor has done it properly for them, engineered their contracts and their licensing, they're going to make tons of money. But if you, as the consumer, do that, I'm going to have junior people defend us from these audits. That's going to cost you a lot of money. Like there's an investment. If you're going to use this technology, there's an investment everyone needs to make sure they're using it properly. I mean, what are you seeing on the other side? You're one of those folks at Palisade who's defending these audits, and you see these third parties. Um, are they better at auditing than the vendor? Is it worse? Is it the Wild West? Like what's going on out there?
Again, it varies a little wildly because, you know, auditing has turned into a business. It's a huge driver of revenue for a lot of these companies. And part of, keeping those profits is lowering your costs as much as possible. experience and training is really expensive. Creating a script that's easy to follow for someone pick up off the street is not. So, just from the business aspect of it, of course, we're seeing more and more audits being run by more junior people simply by nature of increasing the margins as much as possible. Some of them survive and start to learn as they, do more of these audits and they eventually get better. But a lot of people just kind of keep following the script and they never read a contract and they never interact with the environments. And yeah, every once in a while they're going to get blown out by a customer who knows their stuff and, has actually read their agreements. And when that happens, the auditor is going to either, have that be a black mark on their year or they'll escalate it to a manager who is more experienced. But the stakes for them aren't that high. They don't need to stress out about being wrong because it's their job to prove people are out of compliance and just, collect on the bills, as opposed to having any deeper knowledge about what they're doing or how. I imagine, with ChatGPT and whatnot, we're going to start seeing that even more. I have tried at length to get correct licensing question answers out of it and have been unable to do so with any consistency. So I'm going to look forward to the day that we have people relying on that for running their audits because it's going to go fairly poorly. But
We did a podcast, one of the earlier episodes with Max Schlopak and Adia Husha, our friends here at Palisade, and we did just that. We put licensing questions into ChatGPT or Grok or whichever one, I'm not even sure. And some of the answers were just horrible. And some of them were on, right? Okay, that makes sense. But you just don't know. Like, is that a good answer? It doesn't tell you, hey, this is a really crappy answer. I wouldn't rely on it versus this. We know this one is the truth. So I think more vendors are going to start using it to run their audits and more probably more consumers of the technology, the targets, the recipients of those audit letters. They're going to take that audit letter, put it into ChatGPT and say, what do I do? And it's going to say, well, you have to respond within this many days and you have to do this. And that is, I would expect more people are going to fall into that trap because it's pulling vendor information. So it's going to pull, if you get a letter from IBM, it's going to pull IBM's stuff first and sort of craft the answer. So it's not going to be good for the foreseeable future
well, the
for those
problem is
people
that
getting.
documentation contradicts itself very often.
Uh,
These vendors have language that's used very similarly in different spots that mean different things that sound very similar. And in some cases, it's completely contradictory. And in most cases, it's non-contractual documentation to begin with. So I don't foresee those answers getting any better simply because the documentation isn't always good to begin with. And I know way too many paranoid DBAs who are actually never going to write down anything because they don't want to, replace themselves with, training their replacements. So I don't see that necessarily improving. And at the same time, I don't foresee auditors getting particularly better at any particular vendor because, again, they're trying to drive their costs down and do as many of these as possible, as opposed to, the customers who are being audited. Usually it's the people who actually interact with these products on any given day who are answering and asking questions. I mean, I know my basement right now has my special little server room on the side where I've got my sandbox set up. I can spin up, any software we get that we've not audited before, we've not interacted with before. I set up a VM down there and we play with it before we start answering any questions and make sure that what we're actually providing a vendor makes sense. The amount of toner my printer has gone through reading documentation in the last decade is astonishing.
Well, and I think that's the key, is that there needs to be a certain level of expertise. We need to be obviously better than the auditors on the other side, which is, a bar that is not impossible to overcome for sure. Um, there's so much I want to talk about, but we just don't have time from how people are using tools and sort of the role that they play in this process. There's just like so many subjects, and we could talk about audit defense forever. Uh, but unfortunately, we can't because we are time bound here. But I do want one more last question. Um, if you are being audited by a vendor, and this is going to be a little, what is the worst thing you could do? We talked about sort of some of the things you can do, but like, what's the biggest mistake you've seen? What is the number one thing you would say that is going to be a disaster?
Oh, it's like asking me my favorite sandwich. It really depends on the mood. There
Roast beef and Swiss, boar's head roast beef and Swiss with mayonnaise on a Kaiser roll.
I don't hate it, but we could do another hour on that. Um, Really, it comes down to the circumstances. So I'm going to give you a few answers of some of the worst situations because it's also going to depend on something we didn't really touch on today is there's more than one kind of audit. Sometimes it's you get a letter for a SaaS solution where you were never asked a question. You just get a bill in the mail for, hey, we looked at your environment, you went over. Other times it's, a sales rep who's just badgering you with questions and asking you about stuff you might be doing without ever sending you a letter. And other times you go through a formal process. But I guess the single worst situation I've seen people be in is a case where the vendor has better data than you do, which can happen in different ways depending on which audit path you're going down. In some cases, SaaS solutions, hosted cloud provided solutions where the vendor can just look, they can see what you're doing, how you're doing it. I've had cases where, the vendor is in team meetings on a monthly basis, hearing about the development plans and the expansion plans, and they don't jump in during the meeting and let you know, oh, you're not licensed for that. They wait until you do it, and then you get a note from the sales team saying, oh, by the way, we noticed that you went out and did all of this, and people in procurement have no idea what they're talking about. We've had cases where, someone submitted a cloud architecture diagram that they didn't mention was hypothetical and was, they were asking for, how would you consider this licensable? They didn't tell anyone they did it. And, 6 months later, it was coming up as, we know you did this already. And no one knew anything about it. No one knew what they were talking about. Took us ages to even find out who they were talking to. So, the single worst position that you can put yourself in is a case where the vendor auditing you has better data than you do.
Yes, and on that note, one of the best ways to avoid that, obviously, is to have an active compliance program and make sure that you're out in front of this. And the best audit is the one that doesn't happen. So I think, it's rare when we get into an audit and a client is able to, well, first to defend themselves successfully, but maybe even bring down their costs going forward, right? There's always a plus sign when the auditors are in there. Um, which is why I'm excited. When we started Palisade many years ago, we're like, we're just going to focus on Oracle. But again, what I've learned over the last few years is that the skills and the drive and sort of the process and the methodologies across these vendors is very similar. And I used to say to people that we're undefeated in audit defense, right? Every single client that's come to us, let's say with an Oracle problem, is better off having worked with us than they would on their own. They're spending less with that vendor. The compliance problem, it was either brought to zero or at a much reduced amount. Now that we're doing vendor audits for non-Oracle, are we still undefeated?
As of today, we are still undefeated. Yes. Everything that we have touched has gone either to zero or, we've brought the number that was alleged down. We've brought the discount down. We've been able to help everyone we've touched.
That's awesome. And I love the way you hesitated there because I know you're going through your head all the ones that are active and saying, okay, yep, that's done. So it's a real answer, not a bullshit answer. And I expect in 6 months you'll give me the same answer because I, I I just see how these vendors are doing it and the experience that we're bringing to this market. They can't touch us, which is pretty cool. So Matt, thank you very much for your time today
My pleasure.
and boar's head roast beef with Swiss on a Kaiser roll and mayonnaise.
I'm gonna have to follow up with you again. I'm gonna give you a menu, not a single sandwich answer.
Okay, as long as my sandwich is on your menu. Thank you, Matt Giuliano, for your time today. And thanks to everybody for joining us on the world's greatest licensing podcast.